Good morning, everyone. Good morning from Washington, D.C. Of course, especially to our US audience, and of course, good afternoon to our viewers in Europe and elsewhere. I'm Martina Hrvolova, and I'm a program officer for Europe and Eurasia at the Center for International Private Enterprise in Washington, D.C. Today, our partners will discuss the impact of Chinese capital in the Western Balkans, specifically Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and North Macedonia. Before we begin, just a quick note of housekeeping. This session is live streamed on Facebook, so it's recorded. And for those of you who are on Twitter, feel free to use a hashtag Corrosive Capital. Our panelists will be asked questions by the moderator later during the session, but of course, we would like to encourage you to share your thoughts and also ask your own questions using the Q&A room. With that, let me move on to introducing our cast, and I will start with the Executive Director of CIPE, Andrew Wilson. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martina. Good morning, everyone. Whether you're joining us on Zoom or watching us on Facebook, I want to thank you all for attending this launch event for our partners' policy papers on this very important topic of Chinese investment in the Western Balkans. The Center for International Private Enterprise, or CIPE, as we call it, was founded in 1983 on the principle that economic freedom and political freedom are indelibly linked. And today, I think our work is every bit as vital as it was back when we were founded 35 years ago, perhaps even more so with the growing interconnectivity of economies in an increasingly complicated modern world. Worldwide democracies face a myriad of internal and external challenges. For a long time, continued economic growth created tremendous opportunity. However, autocrats are preying on the openness of modern economies. Now, this is especially the case with corrosive capital. And these are monetary flows from largely authoritarian states which lack transparency, accountability, and market orientation, and generally adversely impact the rule of law in recipient countries. As part of our leadership on the issue, CIPE and its partners are designing and implementing local initiatives to address the challenges posed by such capital to the democratic and economic development of the countries receiving it. Today, our partners are going to share their impressive research, fact-based insights, and examples of some of the perilous outcomes of a few of China's recent investment activities in the Western Balkans. These are excellent illustrations to help develop a better understanding and address the challenge. Now, without further ado, I'm going to return the floor to my colleague, Martina, who will introduce the panel.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me now turn to our audience and ask you for a great favor before we move on to the introduction of CIPE's work on corrosive capital. You will see a pop-up window on your screens, and we would like to ask you to take a moment to answer the question you will see on your screens before we move forward. The results will be shared with you shortly after the initial presentation of CIPE's work on corrosive capital. Okay, so now let me briefly introduce you to CIPE's initiative on corrosive capital, and I would like to echo the points made by Andrew Wilson, our executive director. Foreign investment is traditionally perceived as positive input in countries' economy. It often comes with technology spillovers, human capital formation, and international trade integration, contributing to the economic, social, and environmental development in recipient countries and their good governance. Corrosive capital does not necessarily aid such development. And here are the reasons why. Corrosive capital, whether state-owned or regime-friendly, when it comes from the private sector, has a detrimental effect on the quality of democratic institutions. Consequently, the explosive growth of corrosive capital continues to be an alarming trend and most likely contributes also to the democratic backsliding around the world. During the COVID-19 crisis, authoritarian governments have stepped up their efforts to the point of influencing how the public in recipient countries views the authoritarian regimes. Though in many recipient countries, the negative effects of corrosive capital on democracy, human rights, and governance are well documented, capital from authoritarian countries continues to be portrayed favorably. Today, our partners will share their insights about corrosive capital in the Western Balkans to help us make a better sense of the challenge and address it accordingly. COVID is one of the greatest challenges to the global democratic community in terms of its ability to manage crises we have ever seen. It's negatively impacting economies and slowing down also the reform progress. While many businesses are at the inflection point, the private sector must, in our view, play a significant role in post-COVID recovery and reconstruction. And at the same time, it must continue to play a positive role in improving governance. Because investors often assert their business culture, expectations of conduct, and norms, business behavior through their investments. Constructive investment supports broader economic and social goals, such as reducing inequality through the generation of wealth for a greater and wider number of citizens, or connecting regional markets and boosting integration. Constructive capital investment, guided by institutions, business culture, and relationship, can create a vicious circle of wealth, improve governance outcomes, and a better future for the next generation through inclusive growth. Business and investors cannot afford to be passive, and that's why the world needs an action to affirm the values and free market principles that create a market for everyone, an opportunity for every citizen to thrive. Nevertheless, as long as there are countries or societies in which citizens and independent institutions are unable to hold their top leadership accountable, these regimes will continue to project their sharp power, including through corrosive capital. But there is fortunately no shortage of expertise and information on such capital in many countries where CIPE has worked with its civil society partners. And when they're deeply involved in the analysis of corrosive capital, whether it's in Europe, Asia, or Latin America since 2017. The role that our partners play, and so does CIPE, and of course other institutions and relevant stakeholders, is really irreplaceable in this. Local institutions should, we believe, receive help in developing their capacities, and it includes public sector to detect and address the threat of corrosive capital. Part of the solution lies, again, also with institutions like ours. CIPE can empower local stakeholders to advance democratic and market economic principles, not only by promoting an ethical and accountable business culture that fosters inclusive growth, but also by improving governance of public institutions. Our wealth of knowledge allows for significant cross-fertilization of ideas and contributes to growing worldwide awareness and understanding of corrosive capital, as well as ways to address the challenge. To make countries more resilient to the effects of corrosive capital, CIPE civil society partners both map its impact on critical economic sectors, but they also propose necessary regulatory and institutional reforms with input from other affected stakeholders, including businesses. In cooperation with these local partners, CIPE then can design and implement local initiatives to help close governance gaps that can facilitate the inflows of corrosive capital and reinforce democratic institutions by fostering collaboration and information sharing among civil society, the private sector, and the lawmakers. We at CIPE believe that when government, civil society, and businesses work together, they have an important symbiotic relationship. Democracies and economies can flourish as a result, and therefore, as part of our mission and thought leadership, we're determined to work with all stakeholders to work towards this goal. With that, I would like to ask our production director, Lucia, to show us the result of the first survey to see what your opinion on corrosive capital is. And it shows that 70% of the participants of today's event believe that it's a serious threat. 26 believe it does more harm than good, which is, of course, obviously more than a half of the participants that believe that corrosive capital is a significant threat. Thank you very much for your answers. We have one other survey ready for you after our partners from the Balkans present the results of their findings. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Stephen Meringer, who will moderate the session. Stephen is an independent communications advisor and a former head of NATO communications. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martina. I'm honored to have been chosen to lead this discussion panel for CIPE for this event on corrosive capital in the Western Balkans. Good afternoon to our panelists, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you where you're watching on Zoom and Facebook. Thank you for being with us today. I'm joined now by 4 members of CIPE partners from the Balkans. Zoran Nechev from the Institute for Democracy, Societas Civilis in Skopje, Macedonia. Milica Kovacevic from the Center for Democratic Transition in Montenegro. Dario Jovanovic from the Centers for Civil Initiatives in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And finally, Igor Novakovic from the International and Security Affairs Center in Serbia. I'm happy to see all of you this morning, and I just want to say I've really appreciated working with you on your research projects. I have seen really both fascinating and surprising results from your investigations, ranging from highway construction to natural resources to telecommunications infrastructure. And all of these have dramatic effects on the citizens of your nations. And the goal of this event is to promote your research, but also raise awareness on the issue of corrosive capital. So what I would like to do is begin with each of you giving a brief overview of your results from your research reports. Zoran, let's begin with you in Skopje live, where our investigation focused on highway construction projects. Zoran.
Yeah, good morning everyone from the US, and good morning for good afternoon for our colleagues in Europe. China is present in North Macedonia since 1993. Bilateral relations can be characterized as friendly and cooperative, with one exception, and that is North Macedonia's 1999 recognition of Taiwan, which resulted in terminating the diplomatic relation between the two countries until Skopje revoked the recognition in 2001. China has never officially disputed our Euro-Atlantic orientation, as the outlook from Beijing is that this partnership would bring more opportunity to China to enter European markets and politically influence the EU. Our research paper specifically looks at the questionable condition of loans from the state-owned Export-Import Bank of China for the notably problematic Kičevo-Ohrid and Miladinovci-Štip highways as the largest Chinese investments in the country. The investor in this case is the State Road Public Enterprise of North Macedonia, whereas the contractor is the Sinohydro Corporation Limited Beijing, a Chinese state-owned enterprise. The contract agreements were concluded in 2013 with total value of the original contracts of $783.4 million, which is 90% of the total value of the construction works. These works have been financed through a loan from the state-owned Export-Import Bank of China. Because of various problems during implementation, ranging from corruption to weak oversight, as of now, September 2020, The total delay amounts to 1,912 days, or 5 years and 2 months. And the estimated new total value for the highways is calculated over $1 billion. If one adds the interest rate, the total value of the highways reaches $1.2 billion US. And the Macedonian taxpayers would now need to pay over 13.5 million US per 1 kilometer for one of the highways, and that is Kičevo-Ohrid highway. Over.
Thank you very much, Zoran. Let's turn now to Milica in Podgorica, where you're also facing challenges there with highway construction and the Chinese loans that paid for it. Please, Milica.
Yes, we have found that there are many similarities between examples of Macedonia and Montenegro highways. So we don't have that long relations with China being a young state, but in recent year, growing Chinese engagement is observed, especially in areas of infrastructure and energy. And in our research, we also focus on a highway project. It's a Bar-Boljare highway that should connect Adriatic port of Bar in Montenegro with the border with Serbia, and then further connected to the European corridors. Why we picked this project? Because of its huge importance and big size and huge impact on Montenegrin fiscal stability. What is being under construction now is 1 out of 4 phases of the road, and that 141 kilometer long route is being built by the Chinese company CRBC, China Road and Bridge Corporation. It is financed from the loan by the very same Exim Bank of China. And the initial amount of the agreed loan was something over 800 million euros. But with all delays, overruns, forgotten works, currency risks, the estimates are that the cost of this phase will exceed 1 billion euros. We still don't know that because of many concerns and many problems with transparency of this very investment. This project is based on the interstate agreement, having the strength of international agreement, meaning that even our weak legislation doesn't apply when it comes to control and oversight of the works. It seriously increased Montenegrin public debt, so we are now way behind the Maastricht criteria, and without further measures of fiscal stability, it may exceed 80% of GDP. And finally, its finalization is now being given under question. It's not certain because the COVID created a big hit to Montenegrin economy, so we don't know when and whether it will be brought to the end.
Thank you very much, Milica. Now let's turn to Igor in Belgrade, where the corrosive capital issue in your examination has been around natural resources and mining. And this is also something leading to serious environmental problems for the people in the city of Bor. Please unmute, Igor. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Stephen. First, I would like to emphasize something about, as my predecessor did, about the Serbia-China cooperation. So we saw the rise of Serbia-China cooperation since 2009. Actually, back then, the economic crisis of 2008 really hit really hard Serbia, and our governments were looking for foreign investors or loan providers to improve the state of economy. But not surprisingly, since 2009, we had also rise in both economic and political relationship between the two countries. It was confirmed by 2 joint letters on strategic partnership between the two countries. One was in 2009, and the second one was in 2016. Because of this dire need for investments, Serbia was looking for the willing partners, and of course China first bilaterally, and then through this massive program of Belt and Road Initiative, had a cash that was ready to flow if there are suitable projects. But we also, since 2016, saw that this cooperation spread, into real investments. So we had two huge brownfield investments, one in Smederevo steel mill, and the other one in Bor copper's mining and smelting facility, which is the topic of our research. I would also like to stress that we, since recently, we have also greenfield investments, but which are also of largest scale, nearly $1 billion. But I would like to return to the topic of our research. So it's Zijin's investment in RTB Bor, Republic of Serbia, company RTB Bor, and Chinese mining and smelting company Zijin have signed a strategic partnership agreement. That's a model of privatization of state-owned companies in Serbia, and Zijin became a majority shareholder, while Serbia still has around 39% of shares within this company. The agreement was concluded in 2018 after a public tender, which was disputed by some of the participants in it, because they actually, in one media statement, accused the government actually that the tender was not processed in a valid way, because the company that won the tender did not fulfill all of the demands that were set by the tender itself. But in any case, total value of the investments should be, it's estimated according to the contract, $1.4 billion, a bit more than that. But in total, until now, Zijin only fulfilled its obligations regarding the returning of all the remaining debts of RTB Bor. That's around $200 million, and also paid around $350 million for the recapitalization of the company, while the remaining around $850 million are counted as investments and will come in the upcoming period. So why we chose this investment? It's in particular because environment is becoming more and more important in Serbia, and we have seen recently that there are civic activities and engagements at a local level regarding the problems with the environment. Bor, as well as Smederevo, where the steel mill is no exception to that. And what we saw are massive grassroots protests in this town. This widespread consideration about the environment and air quality became nationwide after in January this year, after the mass air pollution that happened in all country, throughout the country. But now, also, what is important and why we chose is that according to the poll that CIPE did prior to we began this research, and during it this year, showed that majority of Serbian citizens feel that foreign investments in this moment benefit mostly investors and to an extent public officials and not citizens, which is a change of perception, because before that, what we had, that the priority was the employment. Obviously, the employment in the country is in this moment, we shall see what are the outcomes of the COVID-19 pandemics for the economy, but in this moment, employment is on probably one of the highest levels ever, and clearly it is the time for rethinking the model of development and focusing not just on employment but on the quality of investments. So I would like to stop now, and maybe I can continue afterwards.
Thank you very much, Igor. Now let's turn to Dario and Sarajevo, where the government spent a lot of citizens' money on new 4G telecommunications infrastructure, but it was done without really proper public oversight. Dario, this just doesn't sound like it was a very transparent business deal.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. And yes, Stephen, you are right. It was a lack of transparency evident in our research. So BH Telecom, as a state-owned telecommunications company, spent over $19 million of citizens' money to buy new 4G equipment from Huawei. The deal was done without proper public oversight or security review. The tender conditions were changed during that procurement procedure, and it was, guess what, completely legal. Overall, the investments in the development of the 4G network in Bosnia and Herzegovina made in recent years mainly come from domestic, public, and private companies that use Huawei's equipment and technology in developing the 4G network. According to our research results, 2 of the 3 leading telecom operators in Bosnia and Herzegovina use Huawei equipment for the 4G network. The use of Chinese manufacturers' equipment and technology would not be controversial per se. However, lately there has been some global concerns with respect to this matter. These concerns have several different aspects. First, there is question around security of Bosnian and Herzegovinian citizens and society, given that Huawei equipment for similar networks has been characterized as a global security threat. Second, from the economic aspect, Huawei, as de facto state-owned enterprise, undermines the market principles of doing business by price undercutting as a result of Chinese politics and incentives from the Chinese state. And third, from the political aspect, Chinese investments in democratic countries is increasingly problematic because of one simple reason: China is not democracy. The research also shows that Chinese capital in Bosnia and Herzegovina is increasingly present, exceeding $4 billion. If we look at other Chinese investments in the region, Bosnia and Herzegovina is actually second of 7 Western Balkans countries by the Chinese investments, and first in per capita comparison. And there are no foreign direct investments in this matter. It is mainly loans and investments in dirty energy and infrastructure in general. If we look our research from legal aspect, we can say that legal framework is outdated and with numerous shortcomings. The telecommunication sector in Bosnia and Herzegovina is currently governed by the law on communications that was adopted in 2003. It has been 17 years since the law was adopted. Technology has changed significantly. The law has not. Also, the latest EU report on Bosnia and Herzegovina from 2019 points out significant shortcomings and give recommendations to be addressed in 2020. None of them is still addressed. Our case study is actually looked on the specific BH Telecom 4G investments from 4 different aspects. One is competitiveness, then transparency, security, and political interference. We can conclude that competitiveness of BH Telecom's procurement of 4G equipment is highly questionable, since other bidders competed with China as a state and not with Huawei as a Chinese private company. Second, BH Telecom's spending of public funds for the procurement of 4G equipment is not publicly available. And in this case, BH Telecom breaches the principles of transparency in spending of citizens' money. From the security aspects, in the context of available information, it can be also concluded that the security aspect was not high on the list of priorities in realization of the investments in 4G network. By our information, not a single institution in Bosnia and Herzegovina paid close attention to this. And lastly, and what is the biggest problem of my country, is enormous level of political corruption, including managerial appointment of the state-owned enterprises directly by the political parties. Therefore, the political aspects of deciding on the 4G technology and selection of the supplier cannot be ignored. I would stop here now.
Thank you very much, Dario. And one of the main factors I'm hearing across all of your research assessments is it's governance gaps that are allowing these problems to happen, almost fostering these problems to evolve. What I'd like is to have each of you kind of briefly talk about the governance gaps that you have found in your research assessments. Let's go back to Dario in Sarajevo. Let's begin with you, Dario.
So as I partially mentioned, I think that the biggest problem is political corruption. So everything is controlled by the political parties, and employment in public sector, public institution, extra budgetary funds, state-owned enterprises is almost exclusively based on the political party affiliation, family affiliation, or some corruptive activity, paying for your job. So literally, it is almost impossible to get a job without political party, family, or corruptive connections. And this undermines the effectiveness and public services quality and the work performance of the state-owned enterprises, but also result directly in breaches of the law and legislation and lack of transparency. So if I have to conclude, I would say that political corruption in combination of the lack of transparency, confidentiality of documents, and public money spending which is actually stated or positioned by the government is actually one of the biggest problems, including in procurement, but in general.
Interesting, thank you. Let's go now next to Zoran. What did you uncover in your research about the governance gaps in North Macedonia?
The loan agreements with China were tailored to accommodate Beijing interests, including with Sinohydro in North Macedonia. They include provisions that are against the EU acquis, that's the body of EU legislation. This includes non-competitive contract awards, so that's direct dealings and undisclosed negotiation between Chinese and Macedonian authorities, and enacting legislation that prevents fair competition. These are basically the two main elements. If we go a little bit more specifically, the loan is conditioned with Chinese companies that are allowed to implement the project. Why I'm saying allowed? Because the Macedonian authorities were provided with a list of companies, of Chinese companies, that were procured by the Chinese government and provided to our own authorities by the Chinese embassy in Skopje. On the other side, our government has enacted Lex Specialis, which is kind of a special law, which is based on an international agreements between China and North Macedonia. And this is the way the two sides managed to bypass the entire public procurement legislation. So in other words, China blocked the rules to ensure its money is spent wisely and in the best interest of its own people. And on the receiving end, the direct dealings do not ensure best value for the money invested. Because we're here talking about high-level deals that involve top tier of political officials, of course, there is always corruption behind it. So, or at least alleged corruption. And this is why the Special Prosecutor Office in North Macedonia started investigating this corruption scandal under the code name of Trajectory, in which 4 officials, including the former Prime Minister, were charged with abuse of power for unlawful financial benefits. The case was declared obsolete due to the fact that 6 years had passed since the possible breaches of law were committed. Therefore, we and the citizens of this country would never learn the truth. However, it became crystal clear that the lending options provided the necessary wide space for various problems during implementation.
Thank you, Zoran. Very interesting. Let's go now to Milica in Montenegro. What did you find there with governance gaps?
We also had lex specialis that enabled the implementation to avoid our already weak oversight and public procurement legislation. And that led to many suspicions about corruption because, for example, one of the benefits that came with the lex specialis is that Chinese contractor CRBC is choosing subcontractors from Montenegro. So we are not that far like Macedonia into already investigating these things as criminal cases, but Montenegrin citizens, Montenegrin NGOs, Montenegrin media are rightfully asking questions. How is it possible that almost all subcontractors for most expensive works, most important jobs are government-friendly companies or companies that are really tightly connected with the ruling or former ruling party now in Montenegro. Second thing is something that Dario already mentioned is lack of transparency. So we at least have that like specialis and contract, but we don't have almost anything else related to the project. For example, several feasibility studies were done and none of them is fully publicly available, but whatever was discovered or leaked is pointing to the key problem that this highway is not profitable, and that is basically why we had to go, why the government had to turn to Chinese, because no one else wanted to fund that. The other thing is that we are only now discovering that there are mistakes in the design because project design was never fully available or discussed. So like, for example, last year we discovered that one entire big loop was fully forgotten, and this is something that will cost Montenegrin citizens additionally, and that needs to be paid for the project to be functional. And finally, because it's a very big story, I can't go deep enough into that. This investment is causing big environmental concerns. The site of the project is the site of the Tara River Basin that is UNESCO protected natural heritage. And already last year, NGOs and UNESCO after that identified that the works were actually harming really bad what is not only Montenegrin River, it's being on UNESCO list, it's a heritage of the entire world.
Thank you, Milica. Indeed, it is a complicated issue, which is why we do encourage everyone to look at these research reports and really try to understand the issues that your nations are facing. I'd like to go now to Igor in Serbia. It seems from what I read in your research report that Zajin got a very special deal in their purchase of RTB board. What governance gaps did you find there? Don't forget to unmute.
Again, I'm sorry. First, unlike some other agreements that were discussed here, the agreement on strategic partnership for RTB board is public. It's not international agreement, but it's a commercial agreement, and as such, it should not contradict the law of the Republic of Serbia. This strategic partnership agreement is publicly available. It's huge. It's not really transparent, so you cannot easily browse it. But in the end, we did the analysis, and what we find out that there are some inconsistencies which put this investment actually in contradiction with the law. So basically, I would not elaborate too much, but the agreement defines that there is a transitional period for the company in which the independent expert group should make an analysis of the current situation regarding the environment and then produce an action plan. This has not been started yet. Then Republic of Serbia claims and guarantees that the company acts in conformity with environmental standards in Serbia and does not believe that any additional investments in this regard would be necessary. But in final point of importance for us, it ensures that during the transition period, RTB board under new owner will not be sanctioned or penalized for environmental damages. And in essence, this provision is in contradiction with the Serbian law. Actually, if we observe from certain point, it derogates the whole legal system of the Republic of Serbia on the piece of its territory. But as I said, this is not legally possible, and probably if the environmental issues become more serious, this will be a matter of dispute. Now, also, what we had during the past almost 2 years, we have unprecedented air pollution in the town of Bor, with sulfur dioxide in particular, but also in certain months during this period, there were high concentrations of heavy metals like arsenic, mercury, cadmium, and others. Just in certain days, for example, in November 2019, concentration of arsenic in the air was 200 times higher than there is a legal limit. Also in December 2019, it was 6 times higher than it should be. So, and this proves that actually there is a huge environmental danger in Bor. Truth to be told, the environmental inspectorate, which is a part of the Ministry for the Protection of Environment in Serbia, starts proceedings, pressed 5 charges against Zijin in front of the local court. These processes still last, but the fact is that the ministry and the inspectorate have the right and have much powerful tools to act against polluters. So in this case, we can see that the response of government is mild, and maybe the explanation for that is in the provisions of the agreement that I already mentioned. Okay.
Thank you very much, Igor. And in trying to put this issue of corrosive capital and sort of frame this on both the positive and negative effects locally, it seems like this is an issue that affects so many important matters that affect not just the citizens, but it's about public finance and innovation and job creation, consumer prices, environmental protection, and a long list. Can we talk about that a little bit? What are the effects that you're seeing at the local level from corrosive capital investment? Let's begin with Milica in Montenegro.
So for Montenegro, it's very obvious that debt is a big problem, and for Montenegro, there is no more cheap money on financial markets, and any further debt will, be under very high interest rates, and that further means, especially in the view of the post-COVID crisis, that we won't be able to finance many other important things like starting, tourism again, which is key pillar of the economy, or supporting small businesses that suffered really much through this, or financing any reforms that we are expecting, especially like, for example, reforms that we need to undertake within the Chapter 27 of negotiations with the European Union, which is environment protection. That all costs a lot. We are now in a, even if there is a magical wand to fix all our rule of law problems, for the accession to the European Union, I think for a very long time, we won't be able to decrease the state debt below the Maastricht criteria and fulfill that basic thing. The key issue is really to ask ourselves whether Montenegro, what's another option? And many people that we talked to through this period were saying that the loan from China was taken only because there was no other way. Montenegrin government in June wrote to International Monetary Fund requesting money from some fund, that continuation of the highway won't be on the table before some fiscal stability is achieved. But this is definitely a huge project in front of Montenegro. It has to be finished. There are 3 more sections, because right now we have some beautiful bridges in the middle of nowhere for which the citizens of Montenegro are yet to start paying the over 1 billion euros credit.
So it sounds like the risk of roads to nowhere, as we have seen in other nations before. Let's turn to Zoran now, in terms of the effect of corrosive capital, consumer prices, and other issues in North Macedonia.
Yeah, well, based on the conservative estimate of the official declared profit, the total or cumulative undiscounted profit generated by Sinohydro North Macedonia subsidiary was $85.5 million during the period 2014-2018. In 2016, Sinohydro was in the 7th place among the largest companies in the country's economy, a 3rd most profitable company in the country. So imagine this. How is this possible? Well, one of our interviewees stated that Sinohydro had in fact constructed only 2.7 kilometers of the highways. In reality, the company engaged 4 subcontractors to implement the construction activities. The subcontractors then have been sending invoices for the construction activities to Sinohydro. Then Sinohydro been re-invoicing for the same construction activities to the Public Enterprises for State Roads at a price 54% higher than the price in the original invoices issued by the subcontractors. If we compare, the golden standard on a global scale is around or maximum 30%. So how foreign investors and their local subcontractors behave shapes the local business culture, and they create expectations of conduct. And obviously, this case study is not the prime example. Another important issue here is profitability procurement. According to the official data from the public enterprise, in the contract for Miladinovci-Štip highway, the price for installation of 1 cubic meter of buffer offered by Sinohydro was $39.4 US dollars. Whereas in the regular public procurement procedure, the same company, we are talking about Sinohydro, won a competitive contract by offering 4 times lower price. So that will be $10 per cubic meter for the same type of work. And this is the issue between competitive and non-competitive procurement procedure.
Thank you for that, Zoran. Let's turn now to Serbia. Igor, what effects are you seeing at the local level and the national level related to this?
Okay, let's unmute first. Yeah. First, as I mentioned, these are environmental issues, but I would like to stress some other things too. The agreement between on strategic partnership also foresees subsidies for working places that should be provided by Serbia, not just for Serbian citizens that should be employed in Zijin, but also for foreigners, in particular Chinese citizens. There is no point actually in providing subsidies for the employment of foreigners because it does not contribute to the development of the country unless we are talking about some very special areas or innovative technologies that would guarantee the spillover effect on the citizens of Serbia, on the employment, development of economy, etc. Here, also the problem with subsidies, and I forgot to mention that in the previous answer, is that Zijin also obtained the richest deposit of copper and other precious metals in Europe that is called Čukaru Peki, and which is in proximity of Bor. So basically next to the other pits that RTB Bor already has. Zijin bought this from a Canadian, by buying Canadian Nevson company, but also, and they also buy exploration rights on the other part of that locality from US Freeport. That means, and these deposits are estimated to be worth 150 billion US dollars. This means actually that if the copper price at the global market remains as it is, relatively high, they will have huge profits. Then the question is why the government should in any case provide subsidies. this did not happen until now, but could be the case in the future, that our investor will demand subsidies from the government. And furthermore, there is one more issue. So I perfectly understand why the government wanted to get rid of this problem, because it was a problem. It was a heavy burden on the taxpayer, on taxpayers' back. But if we want to be more effective, if we take into account the strategic perspective, where we want to go, we have to think also about the future. And the future is innovation, environmentally friendly technologies. And I think that the government, instead of supporting something that is really profitable, but should be left to the investor to support new technologies that would guarantee Serbia's development in the 21st century.
Thank you, Igor. I'd like to turn to Dario now. And the issue of telecommunications equipment there, it's not just a public finance issue that you're facing. There's also security concerns that come with this, right?
Yes, definitely, especially on the global discussion of the threat that it can cause and the harm that it can cause to domestic citizens. So I previously said that it is sensitive from different angles and different perspectives, and I don't want to repeat myself. I would say that regarding the effect or local democracies and economies, I would highly agree with all previously said by my colleagues. I would just maybe shortly add and go step backward, and it is that it harms the competition. Because why companies would compete in the first place if you have nationally supported companies whose goal is not profit, but rather just to enter the market from the political sense and build foundations for some future jobs. And this is what we noticed that actually China is doing in many regions and also Western Balkans regarding the technology investments. Also, many of these investments are very bad. For example, in my country, we are building or renovating 5 coal power plants currently, something that European Union countries are giving up of. And European Union is even highly opposed to building of or renovating these. But governments found a way to build them anyway. And it is through Chinese loans which cost citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina billion of US dollars. And connected to that, there is also a debt trap that was mentioned by Milica.
Thank you, Dario. And these issues of Chinese investment, it has an effect on an international scale as well. How has Chinese foreign investments affected the foreign orientation of the Western Balkan nations? In other words, how are they aligning themselves with the rest of the world? Let's turn to Zoran.
So just to go back a little bit in time, in March 2017, the European Council acknowledged the internal and external challenges facing the Western Balkan, following a visit by Federica Mogherini, then the High Rep for EU foreign and security policy. It became obvious at that time that the lack of clear political commitment to the Western Balkan EU integration will create significant and potentially detrimental opportunities for external influence by other actors, primarily such as China and Russia, to pursue their own economic and geopolitical interests. And this has created long-term risks for the region's democratic and economic development. Meanwhile, things have progressed, although not significantly. North Macedonia and Albania was given green light to open accession negotiation, and North Macedonia has joined NATO. The EU decided, with significant pressure predominantly by France, to make the EU accession process more streamlined, politicized, efficient, and transformative. They developed a new methodology for accession negotiation, and that will be applied not only to the countries that now start the accession process, that's North Macedonia and Albania, but also will be applicable for all the countries of the Western Balkans, including the ones that are already in the negotiation process, and those are Montenegro and Serbia. Within this document, within this methodology, economic integration and economic accession criteria have been placed in the most important cluster entitled Fundamentals. In addition to this, chapters which are related to public procurement, financial control, and statistics are also part of this cluster. Therefore, it is my opinion that such excursion as ours with the highways will be very difficult to conduct in the future, as the countries will be under severe monitoring by the EU and the member states, and it will be really difficult to indebt themselves through Chinese loans.
Thank you. And I'd like to turn to Igor now, if we could, a brief response on that question as well. How is Serbia being affected on an international scale with this?
Well, first of all, we have huge problem with the Chapter 31, that is Common Foreign Security Policy, and for a number of years, Serbia is not aligning with certain EU declarations and restrictive measures that are implemented towards certain countries. In particular, here is China, also Russia, but China is also one of the topics of these declarations. I would like to stress that it's not just about the economic influence or the partnership with China. We have an issue of Kosovo, and for a number of years, Serbia was searching for international partners that are members of the UN Security Council who could help it over struggle over Kosovo. So that was the primary reason. But certainly, Chinese economic influence and the strategic partnership, we had two letters that were developed, impacted Serbia's international behavior. So for example, in past few years, we had certain actions like Serbia publicly, actually I think it was this year, Serbia publicly supported Chinese implementation of the national security law in Hong Kong, or its actions against what China labeled as terrorism in its province of Xinjiang. Also, but there are also other issues related to the process of the EU integration, and that is, I would like to make a connection with what Dario said before, and precisely this is environment. Europe is in the process of implementation of the European Green Deal. This means the total shift of the European economies towards environmentally friendly industries and certain type of penalties for the dirty industries that export to the countries of the European Union. And this means that Serbia, if it continues this way with investing in coal power plants, etc., will raise the cost actually of its products that are produced in those facilities, being it copper or electricity. So this is the problem. So we have to take for our development into account also the European perspective and what are our obligations and what is in fact our interest. Is it our interest to produce an electricity from, I don't know, solar power plants or from coal power plants, having in mind that that there would be fees imposed by the EU on the electricity, for example, that is produced from the coal power plants, which are financed basically these renovations and everything, like in Bosnia, from Chinese loans.
Thank you, Igor. And this brings us down to the last question, which I think is the most important. I do ask you to keep your answers short because we want to make sure that we leave time for the Q&A and to hear from our audience. But it comes down to change. what are the key measures for domestic change for the reformers in your nation to help strengthen the resilience of your country and your government in the best interests of your citizens against corrosive capital? Let's turn to Milica, please.
Oh, well, I'm afraid there is no shortcuts in this. So 2 years ago, we did similar research with CIPE when we were looking at governance gaps and trying to find what can help strengthen the resilience towards Russian corrosive capital. And I can say, at least for Montenegro, but I believe that for the rest of the region, the identified governance gaps are very similar, and our countries did very little to fix those. Even some of our countries, at least for Montenegro, became aware of how that happened. So it's improving functioning of democratic institutions. It's improving rule of law. And in this concrete case, and Zoran already was speaking about that, there is a lot about transparent and competitive public procurement. There is a lot about prevention of corruption measures. We were obviously focusing on concrete on projects, but we need to mention that there is a need to minimize elite capture, which is one of the strategies used by China. And I'm really hoping to this new EU negotiation model that Zoran was mentioning, because the previous one, I must say, wasn't an obstacle. So Montenegro indebted itself all while negotiating with the European Union. So all this happened during the negotiations. So I'm really hoping for stricter oversight, because unfortunately our country seems to behave best when carefully, closely observed.
Thank you, Milica. So we have time for 2 more responses. Dario, can you tell us what is the change that is needed in Bosnia and Herzegovina?
So only one concrete thing I would suggest. Of course, I agree with all previously said by Milica. It would be of utmost importance for the Western Balkan countries, governments and parliaments to consider adopting regulation for foreign investment screening mechanisms. So similar to those that already are outlined in some EU regulations and EU countries, with explicit provisions for the engagement of various stakeholders in investment screening mechanisms and improved transparency of the investments, digital security, and environment protection. That would allow them to neutralize corrosive capital and enhance the contribution of constructive capital to their sustainable development and growth. So companies that implement significant investment projects should be selected through public procurement that is transparent and competitive. Poor procurement and privatization practices are damaging countries' image and send a bad message about the region to those who are ready to invest constructive capital.
Very good, thank you. So last word on this goes to Igor in Serbia. What change is needed?
Yeah, first I would like to agree with Dario that there is no reason for any agreement not to be commercial or not to be transparent, publicly accessible and searchable. And they should be, of course, published as such, along with the justification for their conclusion. Secondly, I would like to say that regional governments and parliaments should balance the needs of the country's economic development and growth and environmental protection. They must also ensure that their policy and regulatory frameworks are in line with the contemporary EU environmental protection standards, but not just in line. They should be also implemented, because, for example, in Serbia we have more or less good environmental laws, but the problem is in the limping implementation. They should also ensure that a proper institutional and informal checks and balances are in place to prevent concentration of decision-making in one institution. Also, institutions' roles and responsibilities are respected. Public consultations are an integral part of the public policy making, because are about most significant investments, I strongly believe in my organization that there should be more public debate. And finally, there should be corresponding sanctions against public institutions, and they should be enforced when needed. And we did not have that until now.
Very good. Thank you much, Igor. Thank you all very much. I've really enjoyed this discussion and hearing your expertise and insights on this issue. I hope we've also helped raise the public understanding and public awareness of what's happening with corrosive capital. I am sure there are some very interesting questions to ask from our audience, and I want to turn the discussion now back to Martina to handle the Q&A. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, everybody. Yeah, it would be also interesting to see what's our audience's opinion, right, on corrosive capital now after this outstanding panel. So I'm gonna ask Lucia, again, our communications production director, to help me out with the same question that we asked you at the beginning. So we're asking you again, what's your opinion? How big of a threat you feel corrosive capital is? And let's see if the opinion of our audience changed in any way after the presentations of our partners. Lucia, let's now share the survey results with the audience. If we have them ready, hopefully we do. And if we get lucky, we'll be also able to compare the results to the results of the first survey. And I'm glad to see that there is a significantly higher number of the respondents who now believe that corrosive capital is a serious threat. We had 70% at the beginning, now we have 91%. So thank you very much for that. And that I see that it was most likely the second group that changed its opinion from, because we dropped from 26% to 4%. So thank you so very much. This is really useful, or also for CIPE. We like to receive this type of feedback. With that, I'm going to move to the Q&A session. We have roughly around 17 minutes left. Thank you so much, everybody who posted their questions in a Q&A room. And I'm gonna start with our own Andrew Wilson, Executive Director of CIPE. And the question to him is, who are or who should be the leaders in guiding processes to ensure that countries that struggle financially are not corrupted by the inflows of corrosive capital? Over.
Thanks very much, Martina. And first of all, thank you to our panelists for, I think, an excellent discussion. I think the depth and quality of your analysis makes the job of sharing an answer to this question much easier, because especially in the final question that was posed by Stephen, I think all of you gave very insightful answers as to what can be done. So I don't know if I have too much to add to that, but just a couple of thoughts. You know, if we look at where corruption occurs, if we look at where the problems are, it was well identified by the panel: public procurement, budgeting and expense monitoring, state-owned enterprise oversight, governance are all areas I think that lend themselves to focus. And I think in all three areas, there's considerable bodies of work and standards out there in the world that can be used and applied to any sort of advocacy work that's done moving forward, or any sort of benchmarking or other types of activities that civil society might carry out in terms of instructing their counterparts in government service and in the private sector as to what needs to be done. Where to look for support? Well, you know, I think most donor countries are still have programs active in these areas. I think it really is a matter of building awareness within the donors themselves as to the nature of what's going on the ground and the threats to progress that these kinds of actions make when we think about, you know, the commitments that donors have made in the past two areas like anti-corruption and public procurement and budget monitoring, and it really is saying, it's really drawing their attention to say, look, here's a threat that's going on. I think the EU was rightly, Zoran in particular, I think his comments about the role the EU can play and the session process can play in driving better standards. I think one of the most illuminating, to me at least, examples of this was last year when the Chinese railway project through Serbia and into Hungary was being proposed. And we could see even with a pro-investment government, shall we say, in Hungary, also a pro-investment government in Serbia, both pursuing this Chinese investment in this construction program. The EU was able to at least put the brakes on Hungarian consideration and procurement for this program using EU standards. And I think the importance there is that those standards are out there and they can be applied. I also know that the multilaterals themselves, the IMF and the bank, are both looking at the impact of this. I think if we look at what a strategy might consist of in terms of approaching these issues, it also helps us pinpoint where assistance might be appropriately coming from. And at CIPE, we've taken a look at this as being a two-track, using the railroad metaphor, a two-track approach. One is standards and the other is practices. In terms of standards, I think what we really are looking at here is the local response to the investment opportunities being brought forth by authoritarian states. We've been looking at China here, but we looked at Russia last year. I think there's also, we can look at countries from the Middle East and other places that also may have attractive capital and may not ask too many questions on investments and may not expect many questions to be asked of them in return. So, I mean, there are a variety of sources here, but the importance here, again, is to be put on local standards. And when we look at sources and strategies to address the local standards, civil society plays a very important role in this. Understanding how these investments are made, understanding what the local standards are. And I think in terms of both drawing support from sources that may traditionally support civil society efforts in this regard, but also from networks. And I think what we're seeing here within this panel is a great example of a network of groups within a region that are sharing information and experience and informing each other's work moving forward, and also building a regional consensus on how these issues play forth, because in a lot of cases, these are big infrastructure projects that are linking countries within the region. And so these programs by their nature become cross-border. And the more we can build common voice cross-border on these issues, I think the better. And if we look at the strategy involved, it's studying it. We've seen that happen within these reports. But it's also then advocating the excellent observations that have already been put forth by this panel, and then monitoring implementation. And I think all of our panelists here have kind of shown us how that can be done. The other side of this is practices, and that has been brought up in a lot of the presentations that have been made here. What is the actual behavior of these firms once they are in country? And we've begun this dialogue around the world, and quite frankly, it's the one where we need to be thinking even more about what are our leverage points. Traditionally, if we're talking about Western investment into a market, there are many leverage points that we can exercise in terms of consumer opinion, national country opinion, traditional media, et cetera, et cetera. And in the case of in the case of corrosive capital, those leverage tools are significantly weaker. A Chinese state-owned firm just does not care the way a Western private firm may care about public opinion. So the question has to arise of how do you motivate public opinion locally, and how do we mobilize public opinion on an international level that may over time, and this is a long-term strategy, may over time affect the practices of these firms? Well, I think a couple of thoughts come to mind. There are, in terms of SOE governance and SOE practices, considerable bodies of work at the OECD and in other locations that really are looking at the ESG impacts of state-owned enterprises. And I know the OECD, for instance, is currently taking a look at these standards right now. There's a review in Paris going underway right now on these issues and on how state-owned enterprises can better comport to ESG standards. And we need to look at that. There's also standards in China, ironically, on some of these issues. The Chinese mining industry does have industry standards. They just don't obey them. And we don't really we have not taken the time yet to access those standards, translate them into local languages, inform local civil society that there are Chinese standards in play. And we should be doing more to try and figure out where are these standards that we can start drawing attention to. Because there is a trend here. I mean, we've done a very good job of sort of monitoring the bad behavior. And one thing we know about China in particular, maybe less so Russia and the Middle East, because our knowledge of that perhaps isn't quite as advanced. But we know the Chinese are listening. And we know the Chinese are starting to amend their practice. And so the degree to which we can identify industry standards, the degree to which we can use donors themselves as advocacy tools to pressure the Chinese into better behavior, to pressure Chinese state-owned enterprises into more accountable behavior, we may see some shift in that. I think we've already seen remarkable changes in at least public stances in the last year and a half since we started raising these issues. We are making progress on this. And so those are the tools at our hand. I wouldn't look to, the US, I wouldn't look to individual countries as being the leverage point or being the funding point per se. This is a much broader network of donors, of individuals, of the private sector, of investors that are taking this on, because what is at the heart of this are competing models of economic activity. This is one area where we have a competing model, but we're also seeing competing models in terms of digital technology, other forms of investment. This is going to be a long journey, and this is one aspect of that we need to build coalitions on.
Thank you, Andrew. It was extremely useful to build on partner remarks and add bits of pieces of really CIPE's thought leadership on corrosive capital. And we all know and would like to stress that our partners' priority is also, of course, to help their own countries, starting with public administrations, to make responsible decisions rather than criticizing anyone, of course. With that, I'd like to move to some other questions that we received from our audience. And I'm going to turn to Dario for a question on media coverage of corrosive capital. I know that Milica would also have a lot to say because her organization has done a lot of work on media monitoring before and during COVID as well. But I'm gonna pick on Dario just because Bosnia and Herzegovina, according to your findings, is the country with the second largest investments from China. So over to you, Dario.
Thank you, Martina. Thank you for this question. Parallelly with the research, we have actually performed media monitoring for the period of 18 months regarding the Chinese investments, or more concretely, Huawei role in investments in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So just to make the complex story short, because we measured more than 20 different characters or tones of the reporting and different data, actually 76% by our finding of the media monitoring, 76% of the articles on China investments are exclusively positive toward China or neutral toward the China. So there is obviously a lack of objective criticisms on some of these investments, especially if we take in consideration that all the critics, or if somebody writes opposite of this, it's usually taking over articles of the foreign media, foreign Western media. So when we compare, for example, positive or pro-reporting and anti-reporting, we see there is a 40% higher rate of the pro-China than anti-China reporting in Bosnia media. When I say pro-China and anti-China, I mean on the investments reporting, of course. If we take Huawei, it is only propaganda reporting. We really do not have some kind of the criticism toward Huawei role before these global concerns about Huawei threat began, because we finished most of the media monitoring before big story globally about Huawei. So the question on the media reporting, just to conclude, is extremely important, because there is a clear connection between the media reporting and public perceptions. And this is almost equally, when you take polls, this is the confirmed. So it more or less agree with the media reporting the results of public perception, and the polls which are more and more in favor of semi-autocratic or semi-democratic regimes, and less in favor of the Western democracies. The trend shows that Western democracy support of the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina actually falls down, and these global trends of semi-autocratic leaders, tough guys who are deciding opposite to the democracy, standard democracy institutions and similar, from the China, Indochina to Turkey, Russia, Hungary, in the Europe, to the, let's be honest, to the US all the way, is something that bring people think that this democratic institution and achieve democratic standards are only obstacles in efficient dealing with the things, especially in times of pandemic and economic recession.
Thank you, Dario. Yeah, and it was proved also by the results of side polling or public opinion perception survey we conducted across the region, first in 2019 and then 2020. And so I'd like to invite everybody, because we of course have very limited time for today's session, to follow us on Twitter or subscribe to our newsletter, where you will very soon also see the analysis of the latest public opinion polling in the Western Balkans that we conducted after the COVID crisis started. You will also learn about perceptions of youth on some of these issues that we discussed today. We had a question from one participant asking about how youth in the region feel about the challenges discussed today and how they're reacting to them, right? And so I would only say that obviously youth leaving the region is a high priority for everyone pooled across the Western Balkans. I don't have the specific numbers on my hand, but I'll be happy to follow up with this participant who asked the question. And with that, I'm gonna ask one last question, and we'll ask specifically Igor Novakovic to respond. It's a question on smart cities, hard to avoid, of course. I know that Dario would also have a lot to say about this initiative. I'm positive because we've seen it unfolded also in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but I'm gonna turn to Igor now. Over.
So, smart cities or safe cities. I mean, in Belgrade, we had a sort of announcement 6-7 months ago that actually the government will implement a project. The local government of Belgrade will implement the project of safe city that would consist of setting up 1,000 biometric cameras for monitoring the traffic. The problem with this is that this is the new technology with advanced algorithm that can also not just monitor traffic and traffic problems, but also has face recognition algorithm, and this fact could actually endanger the privacy of citizens. So what we had, also the problem is where this data is stored. I also want to emphasize that the provider of this equipment is Chinese U of A. So, and in the beginning, when the project was announced, if I recall correctly, the government declined that it procured already cameras from U of A, but all of a sudden it appeared, that fact appeared on U of A's website, and then it was quickly removed. Now in this moment, these cameras are being set up. We still don't know where is the where the data that are collected on the streets are gathering, and what is the purpose for it. Until now, we did not see that it contributes to a large extent to reducing the level of criminality in the country. On the contrary, the only question we can pose is this actually affecting citizens' privacy too much? Because with 1,000 cameras in a big city like Belgrade, it's quite enough to monitor the movement of citizens in center of town and on most important crossroads.
Thank you, Igor, and I'm sure that Dario would echo your comments on this. With that, I see that we already ran over the time that we allocated for this session. And so that's why I'd like to thank again everybody, starting with our audience for joining us today. But of course, our partners in the Western Balkans were the most important piece in the puzzle of CIPE's Corrosive Capital Initiative. Thank you very much. Also to Steve for being so generous with your time. Same for Andrew Wilson, and for sharing your wisdom with everybody. Thank you also to everybody who's behind the scenes of this event, whether it's Lucia, Autumn, Pam, or my soulmate, John. Thank you very much for helping me to putting this event together. With that, the event is closed, and we hope to see you soon again. Goodbye.